My name is Eric Butler. I'm an Oregon State University Extension Service Master Gardener. I'm here to talk today about gardening with Pacific Northwest native plants, an ecological approach. So the purpose of today's presentation is to help you choose the right native plants for your goals and conditions. The guiding principle throughout is going to be to observe nature and copy its successes. The proper culture of native plants, after all, is on display all around us. This raises a really interesting question, though. Just what exactly is a native plant? Simply speaking, it's something that grew wild in our region before the time of European settlement. Unfortunately, it's not always that simple. And so when you're thinking about native plants, they often have very fuzzy boundaries around what's native. The idea of what's native is always geographical. So sometimes it might be something that simply doesn't grow in the wild in this particular part of the world. So blue blossom is a good example. It grows wild, so it's a really valuable native plant for the landscape. It has really attractive flowers on it, evergreen foliage, very low maintenance, very low care, incredibly drought tolerant, thrives in the most difficult soils imaginable. It grows in the wild about as far north as Eugene. Is that a native plant? Another good example is California poppy. It grows wild pretty much everywhere from British Columbia to New Mexico. If you go to your local garden center and you get a packet of California poppy seed, you don't necessarily know where that seed was harvested from. It could be just about any part of the West. So is California poppy a native plant? A third good example is beargrass. You go up to about 4, 5, 6,000 feet up in the Cascades, stuff grows like dandelions. It's just everywhere. It's really, really hard to cultivate down here at the valley floor. Is beargrass a native plant? And then there's yarrow, which is this big, tangled, messy species complex that can be found in pretty much any sort of sunny, dryish habitat in throughout the northern hemisphere. So is yarrow a native plant? So when you're thinking about native plants, you really want to think about finding plants from the right provenance. So good ways to think about this would be varieties and ecotypes. So variety is a natural population, it shares a distinct set of recognizable traits, so you can kind of assume that they're genetically related. Whereas an ecotype is a natural population from a local area. You assume that's kind of genetically appropriate and adequately diverse. A good example of a variety would be something like Kincaid's lupin, which is one of our endangered species in the Willamette Valley. It's a subspecies or a variety of the sulfur lupin, which is pretty common and widespread, but it has different colored flowers, has some other physical traits that really set it aside. And it's really only found in a particular area, whereas the rest of the species is found in other areas. A good example of an ecotype would be something like Douglas fir trees from Clatsop County growing at 5,000 feet elevation. So an ecotype is where you're really kind of sourcing plants from a particular region of the world, a particular set of environmental conditions within that. So you're looking at things like topography, water levels, elevation. And these are both valuable because they're kind of proxies for the quote unquote right genetics. So if you have the right genetics, then you can expect that you're going to have higher survival because the plants are well adapted to their local environment. You can also hope that they have better ecological function because they've co-evolved with the other species in their ecosystem. That said, plants are promiscuous. They'll crossbreed pretty extensively. You even sometimes have plants in different genuses that will hybridize. And so it's really about trying to do the best you can, but you don't necessarily need to expect or hope for perfection. And with this in mind, it's really worth thinking about the local landscape. We have a very interesting geology around here, a lot of topography, a lot of mountains, hills, and valleys. Most of our bedrock is either volcanic basalt or else it's sedimentary bedrock. And then we have these really deep, thick, heavy alluvial soils that were deposited by these Ice Age Missoula floods you may have heard about. So we have very interesting soils around here, tend to be very deep, very clayey and very silty. And so these soils are very interesting because they don't drain very well, but they hold water and nutrients very well. And so most of the plants we have that grow well in our local environment are really adapted to these particular soil conditions. Our climate's also really worth thinking about. We have cool, rainy winters, warm, relatively dry summers. We're what's called a Mediterranean climate. And this gives us a long growing season. A lot of our evergreen plants, such as our conifer trees, often put on about 40% of the growth during the winter months because you don't have hard, extensive frosts that go on for a long time. So there's a lot of plants are well adapted to a relatively mild winters, and they'll start growing very early in the spring. This actually needs to get updated, but in terms of the horticultural zones, we're USDA Zone 8, which is about our winter frost levels, about plant hardiness. In terms of summer heat, we're American Horticultural Society Zone 4. My personal favorite is the Sunset Magazine system, which is really looking at a wide variety of climate conditions at both, not just temperatures, but also looking at water levels and such. And so we're Sunset Zone 6. And so if you find plants that are appropriate for any of these climate zones, then they'll presumably do pretty well in our environment. That said, we also, because of this really complicated terrain, we have a wide elevation range and some really interesting microclimates. So for instance, the northern slope of a steep hill is going to be a very different environment from the southern slope of a hill. Or if you have a sheltered valley, it's going to be very different from an much more open area. And of course, the climate's changing. Climates always change, but that said, right now, the climate's changing particularly fast. We're seeing a lot of signs of this really rapid transition that's going on. We're losing a lot of plants that aren't as drought and heat tolerant. And plant ranges often move accordingly over long periods of time. If you look at the fossil records, you can see that the ranges of any particular tree will always migrate widely around the landscape, around the continent even. And so something a lot of people are thinking about right now is what's called assisted migration, starting to look for plants that are from hotter, drier parts of the region, kind of looking towards southern Oregon, northern California, and bringing up plants from around there to start planting out in their landscape and see if they do well. And there are a lot of plants from south of our region that will have historically done quite well in their environment, so there's nothing wrong with that. But the broader idea of assisted migration is still kind of a complicated one, especially because the mountainous region or the mountainous west is a lot more unpredictable in a lot of ways than other parts of the country. So if you're east of the Rockies, think about assisted migration is much simpler consideration, or it's here in Oregon and the Pacific coast it's a little more difficult to predict what's going to do well. That said, our likely future is going to be warmer and drier, and so there's going to be need for a lot more drought-tolerant plants, and also need for conserving a lot more wetlands type environments to conserve the water that's still here in the environment. And when you're thinking about just increasing the amount of diversity out there and selecting plants from a broader suite of populations and planting more kinds of plants and planting more genetic diversity of those plants, you can hopefully get more resilience out of that because there's just more options out there for things that are going to survive. And the history of their local landscapes are also really worth considering. Historically, it had coniferous forests that dominated the coast and the mountains, and there were natural disturbance processes, things like windstorms, landslides, fires, and so on, that would create openings to these succession processes. And so you have these forests where you have relatively undisturbed parts of the forest that could be thousands of years old, but throughout this environment, you'd also have areas of new and really dynamic habitats going on. So there'd always be this turnover, even if it's on a very long time span. Wetlands are really widespread. You had free-flowing streams, and you had beaver everywhere. They were creating really complex hydrology and a lot of habitat within that. Then we had native peoples who lived in the region for a very long time, thousands of years, and so they would manage the valley oak and prairie ecosystems with fire, and they do a lot of other very sophisticated land management processes. And so a lot of what we would think of as being sort of natural habitats around here really depend on some degree of human involvement to maintain them, often very intensive human involvement. The oak and prairie ecosystems would be burned every other year, even every year. Then when European settlers arrived, they extensively altered the landscape through activities such as logging, agriculture, uh, river control, and then introducing a lot of other species. And so regionally, we have multiple what are called ecoregions, which are sort of big picture ecosystems, areas that have sort of similar, broadly similar sets of conditions. So here in the Portland area, it's mostly the ecoregion is the Willamette Valley, but you can see that there's a little bit of the Oregon coast in there. That's what's called the Tualatin Valley, the Tualatin Mountains. A lot of that is Forest Park, Washington Park, Council Crest area. So that's a little sliver of what's more typical Oregon coast or coast range habitat. Then the West Cascades are pretty similar to that as well, sort of very dominated by conifer forests and such. But there are also plants from the drier east side of the Cascades for the warmer Klamath Mountains area south of us that will do well in our area. And so you can look to really any of these ecoregions for things that might broadly be considered native plants that would do well in a native landscape. And so this is where it's really worth thinking about just what exactly an ecosystem is. An ecosystem has three physical components. They're the biotic components. These are all the living organisms in the ecosystem. These are obvious things like plants and animals, but also a lot of things that aren't looked at as much. A lot of the microorganisms, fungi, soil bacteria, little microscopic invertebrates. A lot of really small things can have really big and important effects on the ecosystem. There are also the abiotic components, which are the non-living factors that influence that community. These are things like climate, water, soil, topography. And they're the structural components, which are the spatial and temporal patterns that arise from these biotic and abiotic factors. So these are things like microclimates, the structure of the tree canopy, patchiness, where you have different physical structure throughout space, and then succession processes and other processes that happen over time also create structure. And from all of these physical components is where you get the functions of the ecosystem. It's also really worth considering that an ecosystem is a frame of reference. The boundaries and the scales are more or less arbitrary. An ecosystem is whatever you define as being an ecosystem. And so a rock can be an ecosystem. So can the pond surrounding that rock. So can the meadow in which that pond is located, the forest surrounding that pond, the mountain range in which that forest is located, even the region of the continent through which that mountain range runs. These are all ecosystems. And in our region, really in general anyway, no two ecosystems are exactly alike. They're very complicated things. And so everyone has its own very specific set of processes and features that are going on. That said, in our region, we have some general types that emerge. So this would be a good place to stop for any questions that have come in so far.
Hey, Eric, this is Wing. We do have a question. I've been told we are zone 8B in the Willamette Valley. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I just have to update that in the presentation. That's been a fairly recent change, and part of that's because our climate has gotten hotter and drier in recent years.
Thanks, Eric. That's all I see for now.
Okay. So some of our regional ecosystems, we have coniferous and mixed forests is probably the most familiar one to most people. And these typically grow in kind of hilly or mountainous areas at most elevations. It's really defined by having these dense multi-layered canopies and mixed understories. And so you have a lot of different layers from the very high tree tops, and you have smaller trees and larger shrubs that grow in the understory. Even the canopy itself often has several layers in it. Then you have everything from very tall emergent trees all the way down to low growing ground cover. And these are historically less common in the valley floor. A lot of that's just kind of the natural conditions. A lot of that is because of this traditional indigenous burning that would really clear out a lot of the conifers and maintain more of the oak and grass species. And these are really kind of typical of every gardener's favorite condition, dry shade. And if you have those kinds of environments in your yard where you're having a hard time growing things, a lot of native plants are really well adapted to that environment. So in these coniferous and mixed forests, you get a lot of these large familiar trees, things like Douglas fir, western red cedar, big leaf maple. And you get some smaller trees and shrubs growing underneath, things like vine maple, longleaf Oregon grape, and then you get quite a variety of herbaceous plants and ferns and such will grow well underneath. Another important ecosystem are ravines. And ravines are really found in steep stream courses, usually within these coniferous and mixed forests, sometimes also within oak woodlands and such. And these may be too narrow to have a distinct tree canopy, but they're really, you can really tell a ravine because there's at least distinct understory vegetation. And these also very typically have a lot of rocks and woody debris that accumulate in them. These are good things because these create a lot of value, a lot of habitat value, having this complex physical structure within the ravine ecosystem. And where you have these perennial flowing streams with a lot of shade and a lot of vegetation, a lot of physical structure, this creates potential fish habitat. And so some of the species you might find in ravines, you'd find trees like red alder, cascara, a lot of shrubs again, salmonberry, Pacific Pine bark, devil's club are all things that are very typical of ravines. Then again, you get a lot of ferns and a lot of herbaceous plants, things like western bleeding heart, and some ferns like ladyfern and maidenhair fern really like having their feet wet. Oak woodlands and savannas are possibly, it's really hard to pick a favorite regional ecosystem, but I have a really soft spot in my heart for oak habitats. And these are typically found in low to middle elevations in the valleys, especially on dry, sunny hillsides. The, by the way, the difference between a woodland and a savanna is that an oak woodland is kind of a semi-continuous canopy. You have a number of trees that are growing more or less together, whereas a savanna is more kind of individual trees scattered throughout more of a prairie ecosystem. And these are very endangered ecosystems. Less than 5% of the original cover remains in the Willamette Valley, and even less than that in the Portland area. And a lot of that's because these environments are also really good agricultural landscapes. A lot of what's left has been degraded. There's a lot of land conversion for suburban development, things like that as well. And of course, because these are so fire-dependent ecosystems, now that regular birding has been removed from the landscape, there's just not this natural, it's just not this regular maintenance process. And so a lot of the oak habitats that are left are gradually being taken over by other kinds of vegetation. The signature species of our local oak habitats are the Oregon white oak. And further south in Willamette Valley, kind of south around down into Lane County, you also get a second kind of oak, the Oregon black oak, that fills in a lot as well. But you also get Pacific madrone and the local subspecies of ponderosa pine that are pretty typical of these environments as well. The ponderosa pine is particularly interesting because it actually won't grow very well east of the Cascades. And then the ponderosa pines you see east of the Cascades won't grow well in the Willamette Valley. Again, it's really well adapted to our local environment. And then you get a number of smaller woody species, things like serviceberry will do well. Poison oak is a very common plant in these oak habitats. Not something you want in your garden, obviously, but out in more wild areas, it has a surprising amount of ecological value, as long as it's not growing too close to where anyone wants to go. And you get a lot of wildflowers and such will grow in these environments. There are also upland prairies. These are found at low and middle elevations of valleys, especially on hillsides, and they often integrate with oak savannas and also rocky outcrop habitats, which I'll talk about next. You also sometimes find them up in kind of what are called mountain balds, areas of sort of shallow soil on top of hills. So something like, if you've ever been up to some of the high peaks up in the Coast Range, you'll often find these upland prairie habitats there as well. And these are really marked by a lot of bunch grasses and wildflowers, occasional shrubs, but it's mostly herbaceous plants. So we have a lot of native bunch grasses that will do they're really typical of upland prairie habitats. Things like Romer's fescue or June grass, which are very attractive garden plants. Then, of course, a lot of wildflowers, several larkspurs, uh, several kind of lily-like plants, and then a lot of sort of tough perennials, things like Douglas aster and goldenrod. There are also rocky outcrop ecosystems, and these have always been fairly uncommon and sporadic. They tend to occur in small patches of shallow soil in the hilly areas. They're really kind of defined by these soil conditions. And the moisture can vary, but they're always marked by a fast range. So sometimes these grow in areas where there's springs that are kind of constantly feeding in water and start washing out the soil that accumulates. So other areas it's just kind of up on top of a hill where there's just naturally not much soil accumulation. And the vegetation tends to be fairly small and fairly sparse just because these are kind of resource depleted areas. And these are analogous to some urban settings. So for instance, if you've seen eco roofs or if you've seen hell strip gardens or things like that, or rock gardens, these are really kind of characteristic of these rocky outcrop habitats. And so a lot of the species that would do well in a rocky outcrop environment would do well in these for tough urban environments as well. And so we have several native stone crops or sedums, for instance. Oregon sunshine is an attractive wildflower. Have several wild onions that would do well. Things like broadleaf shooting star and some grasses and even a couple ferns that do well in these sort of tough rocky environments. There are also wet meadows. Wet meadows are found in usually low elevations in the valley, typically floodplain areas. And these are even more in danger than the oak habitats. Less than 2% of the original cover remains. And again, a lot of what's left has been highly degraded by invasive species and such. And a lot of that's simply because these wet meadow habitats are also kind of prime agricultural land. And so much of what's been out there has been drained and converted to farm fields. And the hydrology of these wet meadows varies both seasonally and spatially. So if some wet meadows get inundated during the winter and then they drain almost completely during the summer, and then there's some areas that are kind of higher up, sort of transitioning to drier meadow habitat, whereas other areas sort of stay wet year round. And so you can find a lot of grass-like species here, things like slough grass, various rushes and sedges will do well. Then again, quite a few wildflowers, things like camas or checker mallow or various lupin species. Also in these wet environments, you find riparian forests and shrublands where you get more woody species taken over. These again found in low elevations of the valley, usually floodplains, stream and pond edges. This is why these rare ecosystems is actually becoming increasingly common. There's a lot of restoration mitigation work that's going on. They're really easy to get established, and if you're wanting to do some sort of ecological restoration, you find in areas you find a stream that just needs some help. You just get a bunch of bare root trees and shrubs and plant them out in the area, and then next thing you know, you've got a riparian forest or shrubland. And of course, where you have moving water and a lot of woody vegetation, almost inevitably you're going to get beaver moving in. And when the beaver move in, they alter the habitat quite a bit, but they create a lot more complexity, a lot more niches within this ecosystem. So on the whole, as long as they're not creating conflict with human needs, having beaver in the environment is a really good thing. So you get a lot of different woody species that are really kind of characteristic of this environment. Things like Oregon ash, many different willow species, red osier dogwood, Douglas spirea, and then you also still do get some herbaceous plants as well, things like yellowwood, violet, or field mint. And of course, the marshlands. They're found low elevations of the valleys, and these are really areas of sustained shallow inundation. There's basically standing water on these marsh environments year round. And these have been lost quite a bit for a lot of the same reasons, but what's left is pretty stable and it's even increasing somewhat as habitat restoration mitigation work goes on. This can be maintained by all kinds of things, whether it's sort of natural topography or beavers creating impoundments or artificial water control structures like weirs. It's really kind of maintained this perennial water level. And here you find a lot of different plants, again, kind of segregated by the depth of the water and so some things like more shallow conditions like gray sedges or Pacific willow, they have other things that water or plants that grow either emergent or even submerged in the water. So things like yellow pond lily or bigger ticks like growing out all the way out into the standing water. And they're upland shrub ecosystems. So these are found at low to mid elevations of the valleys. These are historically less common because having regular fire in the landscape, it kind of knocked down a lot of the smaller woody plants a lot. But they've been increasing a lot because, again, they're really easy to grow. It's really easy to plant a lot of this stuff out. And you do get a lot of ecological value from having them around. But the plants also tend to be tough and versatile and often quite attractive. And so a lot of these are very popular garden selections. So things like silk tassel or blue blossom, mock orange, which is incredibly fragrant flowers on it. And finally, ornamental landscapes are ecosystems. And they're very much kind of what you might call an urban ecosystem. They have a lot of impacts of urban land use, which create very different conditions than you find out in more quote unquote natural areas. But they do have biotic, abiotic, and structural components. And so even just kind of an ornamental selection of plants is going to have some sort of ecological value, but that can vary quite a bit depending upon what you select and upon what you've planted, how you maintain it. And of course, it's also worth considering that some ornamentals are derived from native species, sometimes called nativars. So there are quite a few cultivars of red flowering currant, for instance, many of which were actually developed in the British Isles and brought back here and through the nursery trade. And so when you think about that, when you think about native plants in your garden, you really have to consider that you're growing native plants in non-native ecosystems. There are a lot of pests and diseases that occur in urban places that you don't find out in the wild. So thankfully, we don't have the Asian longhorn beetle you see pictured here, but if it ever arrives, then a lot of our native trees are going to be in trouble. You get wildlife pressures. I've been talking about beavers so far. You get woody plants near water, you're going to get beavers showing up. Or if you have deer or rabbits or other herbivores can have a lot of impacts on native plants. And we also live in an environment where plants really like to grow, and some of our plants really like to grow. So if you have something like yellow wood violet, as you'd see pictured here, or Douglas aster, these will just spread like dandelions. If that's something you're okay with, and embrace it. But if you want stuff to be well behaved, then some of our native plants might not be the best choices. There are other native plants that are surprisingly difficult to grow. We have a number of native orchids that are incredibly difficult to transplant, incredibly sensitive to disturbance. A lot of them have actually become pretty rare out in the wild from people trying to dig them up and transplant them, they just die. And so something like the lady slipper or the fairy slipper orchid, which you see here, is now legally protected. We also have really unfavorable conditions a lot of places. We have a lot of hardscaping, a lot of pavement around that creates unusually hot conditions that are especially stressful to a lot of plants. So you have a lot of heavily impacted soils from the developed areas, a lot of other stuff going on this can be kind of hostile to plants that aren't adapted to these kinds of conditions. And some of our native plants can be hazards or nuisances. So if you have something like black cottonwood, that's incredibly valuable habitat plant, that's also really messy. And so you really want to think about right plant, right place, right care. It's the same rule that goes to selecting any sort of plant for any sort of landscape. And you think about the purity dilemma. Do you want to just plant all native? You plant just have some native plants, or do you even just want to go kind of barely native, just pick out one or two things that kind of look nice? It really depends. So you want to think about, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to see in your yard, and what do you want to do with your garden? Also depends on the conditions. Just because a plant is quote unquote native doesn't mean it can just grow anywhere within our landscape, as you've seen through our ecosystems. And of course, it matters what's available. There are a lot of plants out there that aren't grown very often, or this stuff that's very popular and that sells out quickly. So you have to, within what, and then within that, you also want to think about what's suitable. So given that you have this smaller list of plants that you can actually get, what plants from those possibilities meet your goals and your conditions? And so this would be another good place to pause for questions. So if you had any come in.
Eric, I don't see any new ones.
Okay. So with all this in mind, it's worth going through some different garden concepts that will help to answer some of these questions. So one really popular concept is the pollinator garden. It's something a lot of people are doing these days. I've been involved with some public pollinator gardens myself recently. It's a good place to focus on low maintenance shrubs, wildflowers, and bunch grasses. You really want to think about having the greatest diversity possible flowers, have flowers that bloom at different times of year, think about different flower types and different shapes, different sizes, different colors, provide as many different kinds of resources over the longest period of time possible. It's also really worth thinking about host plants. It's, it's this quote I heard recently, people love butterflies but can't stand caterpillars, but the caterpillars often have much more specific needs than the adults do. An adult butterfly can just kind of flit around to whatever flower is available and feed off of them. But the larvae often need very specific host plants. There's some of our native butterflies will actually only use one native plant. And then it's also worth considering that not all flowers work. So some flowers are very showy and attractive looking, but they don't provide the pollen or nectar resources that adult pollinators need. And there are other flowers that really don't look like much, but can be incredibly valuable resources. So our native willows, for instance, have pretty inconspicuous greenish kind of flowers, but they are probably the single most important early season nectar source for most of our native bees. It's also really worth including abiotic habitat features. So pollinators need water sources. They need habitat. They need physical habitat. So patches of bare soil for ground nesting bees to access, piles of debris for a lot of insects to shelter, and having nesting sites. So if you're doing mason bee boxes or something like that, it's worth having, meeting all of the needs of the pollinators and not just flowers. And of course, you really want to minimize pesticide use as much as possible. Even some fungicides and herbicides can have negative impacts on pollinators, not just pesticides. As a good plant picks for pollinator gardens, again, you really want to go for the greatest variety possible. But some of the top picks within that would be red flowering currant. It's very attractive to hummingbirds. It starts blooming right around the time the rufous hummingbirds migrate back into a region, and usually the Anna's hummingbirds really benefit from having them as well. Ocean spray is another really attractive one, large shrub that blooms in the spring and attracts quite a variety of bees and butterflies. Douglas, and also some later season flowers like Douglas aster and Canada goldenrod provide a lot of resources for bees during a time of the year when there's not a lot else around. And blanket flower is another kind of fall bloomer. And showy milkweed is our native host plant for the monarch butterfly. It's also a very attractive plant that attracts quite a number of pollinating insects. And there's an annual wildflower called the globulia, which is one of the top performers for supporting bees as well. Another really popular concept these days are green stormwater infrastructure, so things like rain gardens and bioswales. And these are typically thick plantings of grass-like species with dense root systems. They're really designed to slow down the movement of stormwater runoff, really filter out a lot of the contaminants and help it absorb into the soil much more slowly rather than just rushing away down to the storm drain and overwhelming the system. And then you can also incorporate other plants onto the banks, but having these really dense grass-like plants growing down in the bottom is what's going to provide the function. And the native plants you're growing in a rain garden or bioswale should be considered functional elements of an engineered system, with ecology being kind of a secondary goal. So you don't, it's also, you really need a consultant expert first. These require a lot of design considerations. They have to be the right size, the right functionality for the site. They're not appropriate to all locations. So if you live up in the West Hills, for instance, they've discovered that say green stormwater infrastructure can actually increase landslide hazard by increasing the water saturation, unstable soils. So if you want to do something like this, I would talk to your local soil and water conservation district and get an expert consultation from them. That said, if it's appropriate to your site, some good plant picks for this would be something like, again, a lot of these grass-like plants, so dagger leaf rush, tufted hairgrass, a small fruited bulrush if you have some place that's stay more inundated year-round, and then most sedges will do really well. And then you can also plant some wildflowers up in the banks, things like checker mallow, Oregon iris, camas will do well in sites where they get this heavy seasonal water. If you're interested in doing a hedgerow, it's a good place to focus on small to mid-sized shrubs, especially a lot of these really attractive species. These can be used for all kinds of purposes, whether it's if they're trying to create habitat, use it for erosion control, create sort of a privacy hedge, or even just kind of general low maintenance landscaping. It's really worth thinking about the idea that hedges are edges. These, even out in the wild, you find these sort of shrubby landscapes and sort of transitional zones between a forest and a meadow area, or kind of between a riparian and an upland area, something like that. So these are really good. These are really valuable for creating a sort of a softer edge or an ecotone between two different habitat areas. There's a good plant picks for these. So you've got a lot of different options. Again, things like blue blossom, red flowering currants, tall Oregon grape, grace wild roses, honeysuckle, mock orange. If you're doing a woodland garden, this is a good place to focus on shade-tolerant plants, so small trees, shrubs, ferns, and herbaceous plants. You also really want to maintain leaf litter and woody debris. This is your excuse not to do as much yard work. Let the leaves fall, let the down branches fall, let it just accumulate. That creates a lot of value to its ecosystem. It's sort of natural mulching that a lot of our native plants really depend on. And if you don't have enough of this already, you can also supplement this. I really like using arborist chips because partly because they're really diverse, really have a mix of a lot of different materials, and so they break down at different rates and provide a lot of really support a lot of resources, not as kind of sterile and not as ecologically useful like a bark dust or something like that. And they also have the added benefit of being free. Then a good thirsty work. So a woodland garden is also the answer to the question, what do you plant under Douglas fir? So the answer to what you plant under Douglas fir is a lot of our woodland plants. So things like Indian plum or salal. A lot of wildflowers do really well too. Things like trillium, false almond seal, and a number of ferns. So sword fern is a really tough and versatile plant for woodland gardens. If you're interested in doing a meadowscape, it's a good place to focus on bunch grasses and wildflowers. It's kind of a similar species mix of pollinator garden, but more grass focused, probably not using many shrubs. And there's a whole wide range of conditions you can do this in, from very wet to very dry. It could be just about anything from sort of a wet meadow, almost marsh-like habitat, up to upland prairie, even rocky outcrop kind of environment. And these are sometimes used as a water-wise lawn substitute, where it's just you're establishing something that's got more of a natural look and that doesn't require regular mowing or anything like that. And so good plant picks for meadowscape would be something like Romer's fescue or slender wheatgrass, June grass, and a number of our native grasses are very attractive. So, for instance, down at the bottom of the picture on the right is what Romer's fescue looks like. There are also quite a few wildflowers that do well here, things like various larkspurs, Douglas aster, goldenrod, or clarkia, which is also known as farewell to spring because it blooms right around the end of the spring flowering season before the summer species come in. If you're interested in doing wetland restoration, it's a good place to focus on riparian trees and shrubs, and also really doing hydrology and shaping the landscape first. So if you have a stream that's gotten really channelized and boxed in, you want to kind of open up that floodplain first and then start getting in the doing erosion stabilization and such before you really start getting the plants in. And a different target wildlife may have different habitat needs. So if you're trying to put a lot of shade around a creek to try to lower the water temperature for fish, then that's where you'd want to get really dense, woody, tall vegetation and try to get that shade over the creek. Whereas if you want more of an open pond-like environment, then you might pick more low-growing plants, get more open space around there. And of course, where you have water and woody plants, then you're likely to get beaver moving in. And so that's something you need to be prepared for and think about how to mitigate. And because wetlands have a lot of legal protections around them, there are rules and regulations that can apply around doing wetland restoration. But on the other hand, that also means that there's a lot of opportunity for expertise and for funding and other resources for doing this successfully. So if you have a wetland you want to restore, again, a good resource for that would be your local soil and water conservation district. They can connect you to whatever you need to do and even implement a lot of the work for you. Good plant picks for a wetland restoration would be getting a lot of these kind of brushy, woody plants. So things like red osier dogwood, native willows are really good. Douglas spirea is a really good one, really easy to establish. A cascara is another good one because it's a beaver resistant. Then again, you can also get a lot of grasses and the herbaceous plants incorporated into that as well. For interest in gardening for birds, it's a good place to focus on fruit and seed-bearing plants, structural complexity, and possibly most importantly is attracting insects. Even birds that mostly feed on fruits or seeds or other such things will really depend on having insects during breeding season. They really need a lot of protein and fat to feed to their young. So native plants are wonderful for that because they, generally speaking, attract a lot more insects or a lot more valuable insects for birds than non-native ornamental plants do. It's also really worth thinking about at least considering abiotic habitat features, so things like nest boxes, bird baths, feeders. Now, these are really valuable things to use as sort of supplements to the habitat, but you don't want to depend on them too much. And if you do use them, you really want to practice good sanitation, clean out the nest boxes at the end of the season, sanitize your feeders regularly. Don't put out too much food at any given time. Keep them out of the rain because if you don't have regular cleaning, then these sites that attract a lot of different birds to the exact same spot can end up becoming disease issues. Or if you have bird feeders that end up scattering a lot of seeds and stuff out into the ground, that can attract rats and such as well. Also, if you want to attract birds to your yard, you really want to mitigate a lot of hazards, things like cats especially, or if you're having issues with window strikes, you want to do work to reduce those hazards. Nighttime lights can be incredibly stressful to birds, again, especially during migratory or breeding season. So leave your back porch light off at night. Close your curtains after dark. Then having a lot of pavement or hardscaping, for reasons we're still not entirely sure of, also seems to be associated with reduced reproductive success in backyard birds. And so, again, having just kind of a softer, more welcoming environment back there in your yard is going to be a good thing for birds. And even with all this considered, an individual backyard could potentially be what's called an ecological sink. It's something that birds perceive as being a really valuable, attractive habitat. They'll move in and then they'll start encountering all these hazards and stresses that will potentially be harmful to them. So this is a good opportunity to talk to your neighbors. Start building up so one yard in an otherwise hostile landscape might not be a good thing for birds, but if you create a bird-friendly neighborhood, then you're really then you really have the opportunity to do some real good. If you're interested in doing a green roof or a green wall and other kind of green infrastructure, it's a good place to focus on these small, very drought-tolerant herbaceous plants, the kind of rocky outcrop species. And these may need some supplemental irrigation during the summers, especially if you end up with a particularly hot, dry spell. But usually that just means like an inch of water once a month or something like that. But again, these are utility first and landscape second, so you really need to consider the engineering that goes into this. A green roof is really something that is built all the way from the rafters up to be a green roof. It's not like you can just tear your shingles off and put up a planter. And so if you're going to do something like this, you really want to think about the entire process and get expert consultation on it. Let's say if you have a green roof or green wall that you want to do, this is a great place, again, for a lot of these rocky outcrop species, things like stone crops, wild onions, wild strawberry, Henderson's shooting star are all good choices. If you're interested in doing bank stabilization, it's a good place to focus on a lot of these low maintenance shrubs and ground covers with strong root systems, and really getting a diversity of root systems in. So some things that have these kind of spreading fibrous root systems really stabilize the top part of the soil surface, and other stuff that where the roots go down a lot deeper. So thinking about layers underground as much as you do layers above ground. And then, of course, selecting the plants by the sun and water needs. So if you have a bank stabilization next to a creek, is going to look very different from a bank stabilization next to a road. And when you're doing this, you also really want to implement erosion mitigation along with the planting, whether it's putting down jute netting or doing heavy mulching or pulling up silt fences or something like that, or even regrading the bank. And of course, this can overlap with all kinds of other ecological functions. So a bank stabilization is kind of as much a strategy as it is a habitat. The good plant picks for this would be really anything that kind of suits the site, but especially a lot of woody species, things like snowberry or wild rose spread laterally quite a bit, whereas something else like ocean spray or tall urban grape is going to have deep tap roots on it. And having ground covers like kinnikinnick are really valuable as well. Then even herbaceous plants like fringe cup and lady fern can provide a lot of these sort of fibrous roots I was talking about, or again, native grasses are good for that as well. And you might just want to do a display or demonstration garden where you're really just growing native plants because you find them interesting and want to show them off. And so this would be a situation where you manage as an ornamental garden rather than a habitat or functional installation. So top plant picks for this are really kind of whatever catches your interest. So it might be something really unique looking like Pacific Madrone. It might be something like bunchberry that grows in fairly unusual conditions. It's a species that's really best adapted to growing on down raw logs and decaying wood, really likes a lot of organic matter. Or if you're interested in doing some in an edible garden, you might want to grow something like camas. Or if you're interested in doing sort of a pond garden, a yellow pond lily would be a great choice for that. So this would be another good place to pause for any more questions that have come in.
Let's see, Eric, I don't see any new questions.
Okay.
We do have one question that just popped up asking for a copy of the PowerPoint. The recording of this session will be on our Facebook page under our videos immediately after this, and then we will have a slightly edited version added to our YouTube library within about a week. And then Eric, do you provide landscaping design services?
I don't, but I have some resources that will be coming up soon.
Great, thanks, Eric. That's all for now.
Okay. So now you're surely asking, where do you get native plants? One good possibility are fundraiser sales. See, things are a little bit disrupted right now, but a lot of people are figuring out how to make them work again. So, but fundraiser sales are great because they support good causes. These are usually run by local environmental organizations and local community. And these could also often come with helpful advice. They often have experienced salespeople on site who know a lot of know a lot about and are passionate about native plants. And so it's a good place to kind of ask questions and figure out what plants are really best suited to what you're trying to accomplish. These are, of course, seasonal. These aren't just kind of available on demand. They often have limited selection and can be first come, first serve. They just sort of have a finite number of plants and you get what's available. There are a number of specialist nurseries and seed suppliers out there that really focus on doing native plants. These can be great because they have wholesale prices, uh, often excellent selection, and then expertise, people who are really in the business of providing native plants and providing the highest quality native plants. But they can often be in remote locations. They may or may not sell retail or small orders. A lot of them are wholesale growers who really mostly grow for restoration contractors and public agencies. They're really growing plants to be planted out in the natural environment. They don't necessarily sell to anyone who just comes along to put things in the garden, but there are some who do retail sales as well. Uh, Garden centers are getting increasingly interested in native plants because there's such demand out there for them. These are great because they typically have attractive plants that are convenient to get to. They're open for retail sales all the time. But because they don't have the specialization in native plants, they may not have the expertise you're interested in if you're looking to do more ecological focused gardening. And they may only have few choices. They may really favor cultivars or a few things that are particularly attractive and easy to grow and especially popular, but they may not have a lot of the more obscure stuff they might be interested in. Or they may have non-local stock. They may have something like tufted hairgrass that comes from some other part of the country, or they might sell Kinnikinnick cultivars that are associated with the East Coast. And of course, if you know what you're doing, you can collect and grow your own. And this is great because it can be free or cheap. You can do your own quality control, but it requires a lot of knowledge, requires a lot of work, and there can be legal limitations and other kinds of considerations you have to do around them. You have to be careful about not spreading diseases and pests, or not kind of doing what's called genetic contamination, where you bring in plants from too far away from a different part of the world and kind of bring in non-native genes into the local population that aren't as well adapted. And of course, there are legal limitations, especially if you're collecting private land. You have to have landowner permission. You have to get a permit from the state forest service to dig up sword ferns on the coast range or something. There's a good list of so now I'll provide a number of resources. So there are quite a few books and publications out there. So something like Garden with Native Plants for Pacific Northwest. The third edition extensively revised, just came out a couple years ago now. It's a great book. If you're interested in gardening for wildlife, then Russell Link's Landscaping for Wildlife in the Pacific Northwest is a great resource. The number of OSU Extension publications are all available for free in the OSU Extension catalog online. If you're just interested in learning more about native plants, Poacher and McKinnon is probably the single most popular field guide out there. And if you're interested in meadowscaping, West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District has a meadowscaping handbook available for free download on their website. There are quite a few online resources as well. There are a number of native plant databases out there. The Oregon Flora Project just launched a new website last year that has a whole gardening advice page on there. And so you can find out information on literally any plant that is known to grow out in the wild, whether it's native or naturalized in the state of Oregon. And they have a lot of gardening advice for different kinds of goals and different kinds of conditions. There are also some national sources out there. Things like the National Wildlife Federation or plantnative.org have good resources. The Jersey Society for Invertebrate Conservation has a lot of good information gardening for pollinators. In Washington County, Clean Water Services, the local storm and sewer provider, has a lot of native plant resources on their website as well. And then there's also quite a bit of expertise out there. The Native Plant Society of Oregon's got a good website. Backyard Habitat Certification Program is now in all 3 counties in the metro area, so they've got a lot of they have a lot of resources, and it's a great program to get involved with. Your local soil and water conservation district can provide expert consultation and fiscal resources for a lot of habitat restoration work. There's a Facebook group called Oregon Native Plants where you can call in information, and you can get everything from identification to gardening questions. And then Metro Master Gardeners are also a wonderful resource. So in conclusion, observe where and how native plants grow in nature. Go out hiking your favorite local green spaces, see what's blooming, see what's growing, see what's thriving in that particular environment. Choose the right plants for your goals and conditions. And remember, right plant, right place, right care.